Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Beauty and biblical evidence both lie in the eye of the beholder and are open to interpretation and misinterpretation. This video will take an evidence-based approach to biblical verification through archaeology, the standard science used to find, study, age, and verify historic materials. To some, simply faith and taking the biblical text as it is sufficient to believe in the Bible stories and its characters. To others, especially those who are prepared to question things and don't accept blind faith, a more logical, evidence-based rationale is applied and greater clarity is often revealed. Let's explore the archaeological evidence broken down into 4 categories: people, artifacts, places, and events. There are approximately 3,000 individuals mentioned in the Bible across the Old and New Testaments, and around 53, that's 1.8%, have been found via archaeology. Of the 1.8%, the vast majority are either Egyptian pharaohs or kings of neighboring countries, and these individuals play little to no significance in the biblical text. Of these approximately 53 individuals, only indirect evidence has been found by way of inscriptions and references in contemporary documents. No identifiable bodies or even bones have ever been discovered. We will explore some of these individuals shortly. There are plenty of claims that various bones and other body parts held by churches around the world belong to biblical figures. However, you can largely disregard these as being fakes. For example, known as the Holy Prepuce, several churches genuinely claim to possess Jesus' foreskin, kept after his circumcision. This in itself poses so many questions, one of which is how and why the church would keep the foreskin of a baby they did not know was going to be Jesus the Saviour. Nobody knew. There is simply zero physical or archaeological evidence for the Jesus character, the most famous man to have walked the earth. The cave of Machpelah in the West Bank city of Hebron is the alleged burial place of the matriarchs and patriarchs, namely Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. The cave was explored by the Augustine canons in the year 1119, at which time they claimed to have found the bones of the patriarchs. To this day, the cave remains a mystery, with no real evidence of this claim. In 1967, Moshe Dayan, then Israel's Minister of Defense and an amateur archaeologist, explored the cave and found no bones. Modern archaeology of the cave conflicts with the 12th century description of the cave and its contents. Also, the dating of the masonry, stairs, and structure are vastly different. We can find no evidence of any prophet or holy character in the Bible. One of the single most important figures is that of the Old Testament character Moses, and the Bible ironically states why his remains will never be found. Bearing in mind that apologists believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, including this very text about his own death and burial, brings into question the validity of the biblical text, thus a possible reason for the lack of archaeological evidence regarding biblical people. The 53-person list of biblical individuals found through archaeology is a list of kings and pharaohs. Pharaoh Shishak, mentioned in 1 Kings, is a primary person that Bible apologists mention to prove their point. But let's look closer at the evidence. Scholars easily prove the anachronism here in 1 Kings, that it was written during the Deuteronomic history period around 550 BC in the Babylonian exile, hundreds of years after the reign of Pharaoh Shishak in 940 BC, thus written from a vantage point well in the future. This is just one inconsistency. Alongside inscriptions of Pharaoh Shishak, there is no mention of King David or King Solomon, who are the main biblical characters in the story. There are no archaeological findings of King David or King Solomon in any Egyptian records. On closer analysis of the 53 individuals, 34 alone are from the Deuteronomic history period, and the period that they are referred to in the Bible differs greatly with that of real history, thus not credible for biblical archaeology. There is no archaeological evidence of Jesus, his disciples, or any of the prophets. The people who Bible believers look to for inspiration, who wrote the moral codes, who performed miracles, who taught divinity, who were the authors and influencers of the biblical texts. In the absence of physical bones, we have unsubstantiated claims of artifacts belonging to biblical characters. The holy nails found by Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, who by no coincidence was sent to Jerusalem specifically to find artifacts 300 years after Jesus' death. We will expand on Constantine's influence later, as he is key to the whole reason why biblical archaeology is so hard to prove. The 14th century shroud of Turin is said to be the burial shroud of Jesus, but radiocarbon dating has proved this to be a fake, being made between 1260 and 1390 AD. Probably the most famous artifact is the Holy Grail, the cup Jesus apparently used during the Last Supper, and the very same cup claimed to be used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch Jesus' blood at the crucifixion. From Israel to Latvia to Scotland, there have been claims of over 200 Holy Grail cups found. None of these claims have been substantiated, and there's no evidence that the Holy Grail as a historical artifact even exists. There are a handful of other artifacts, but the conclusion for all of them is the same: yet another baseless claim. In Jerusalem today, there are two sites claiming to be the location of the tomb of Jesus: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Old City of Jerusalem and the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. The Garden Tomb was identified as the tomb of Jesus in 1867 and lacks historical credibility, and is actually dismissed by scholars and archaeologists. It took until 326 AD for the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre tomb to be discovered by Emperor Constantine, which just so happens to coincide with the various Roman Council discussions around the formal establishment of the Christian religion at that time, for example, the Nicaea Council. The New Testament Gospel accounts give a brief description of the tomb, which correlates to the archaeological evidence available today regarding first century tombs in the area of Jerusalem. But no specifics are given as to the tomb's proximity to Jerusalem, much less its exact location. After the event, only two biblical writers make reference to the place of Jesus' death. The book of Hebrews simply states that it was outside the gate of the city, and Revelation alludes only to the city where Jesus died. No writer in the first 2 centuries mentions the location of the tomb of the man they called the Saviour, Jesus Christ. During the last decade, much material has been written about the Holy Sepulchre's tomb. Professor Martin Biddle of Archaeology at Oxford University has been closely involved in the quest to restore the tomb and its structure. He states, although there has been no lack of surmise, nothing whatever is known of the later history of the tomb of the Gospels in this period, down to 135. Indeed, there are no eyewitness records to verify the assumption that this was the tomb of Christ, and nothing has been recorded to authenticate the discovery. At best, it was the chance discovery of an anonymous tomb that supplied a convenient story. Even the church has tried to make money out of the Bible myth, as there was a huge market in such fake religious relics at one point in history. The refusal by church authorities to allow any of these relics to be analysed and carbon dated lends weight to the fact that they are aware that they are fakes. Of a total of 16 sites clearly said by the Bible to have been destroyed, only 3 produced archaeological evidence for the destruction around 1200 BC. Of the remaining 13 sites, 7 claimed by the Bible as Israelite destructions either were not even occupied in the period or show no trace of a destruction. Finally, for 6 of these 16 biblical sites, archaeology is simply silent. They have not been positively located, or they have not been excavated sufficiently to yield evidence. Secondly, if we look at the picture of the 12 sites said by the Bible not to have been destroyed by the Israelites, mostly in the book of Judges, 5 have been excavated and indeed show no destruction around 1200 BC. The other 6 either have not been dug or have produced inconclusive evidence. Finally, there are at least 12 other late Bronze Iron 1 sites, either unidentified or not mentioned by name in the Bible. Of these, 6 were destroyed in all likelihood by probably the Philistines and 1 by the Egyptian pharaoh Meneptah. The other 6 were destroyed by unknown agents, although there are no biblical stories to that effect. It may be stated confidently that the archaeological evidence today is overwhelmingly against the classical conquest model of Israelite origins, as envisioned in the book of Joshua and in much biblical scholarship. Of all the biblical events, the Exodus story is probably one of the most significant, involving a huge number of people, thus likely to be proven via archaeology. Though many biblical scholars find that the Exodus story may include a small amount of historical memories, unfortunately to date, none of this period provides clear evidence to embrace the Exodus as historically reliable, or that some of these details invalidate the hypothesis that the Bible is an important source for historians but cannot be taken literally. It seems that through desperation to simply believe the text, Bible apologists cling onto the pseudo-archaeology of Ron Wyatt, an amateur American adventurer who claimed to discover a multitude of biblical evidence, more than any other scholar in the field. His finds have consistently been proven to lack all credibility, historically, archaeologically, and geographically by professional archaeologists and Bible scholars. Ron Wyatt has claimed, among other things, to have discovered the following: the Ark of the Covenant, chariot wheels and other relics from the bottom of the Red Sea as part of the Exodus, Sodom and Gomorrah, Noah's Ark, Mount Sinai, the rock at Horeb, the true site of Korah's earthquake, Noah's house and the graves of Noah and his wife, the real site of the crucifixion, an actual sample of Christ's blood, the tablets of the 10 Commandments. Not surprisingly, despite a media campaign to promote his archaeology, every single one of his claims have been scholarly debunked and proven as fake. There is very little indisputable evidence for the Exodus. Archaeology has still not proved the validity of the Exodus account. The attempt to use archaeological evidence to support the case for the authenticity of the Torah's narrative has not succeeded. Let's take a closer look at what the experts in this field say. Carol Myers, a professor of religious studies at Duke University, she says, after more than a century of research and massive efforts of generations of archaeologists and Egyptologists, nothing has been recovered that relates directly to the account in the Exodus. Dr. Paz, a senior archaeologist with the Israel Antiquities Authority, he says, there is no archaeological evidence of the Exodus event. He goes on to say, the event of the Exodus from Egypt as described in the Bible is probably an event that never took place. As an archaeologist and scientist, I can judge only according to the findings, and the findings do not support the myth of the Exodus. World-renowned Professor Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, he says, there is simply no archaeological evidence of Israel's sojourn in the Sinai at the supposed time of the Exodus in the 13th century or any other earlier period. So many of the archaeological finds that were meant to prove the Bible turn out to be a fraud, a fake. Like the Noah's Ark discovery in 2010 known as the parachute fraud. There are no peer-reviewed articles or independent reviews proving any genuine archaeological evidence in support of the Bible characters, patriarchs, or Jesus himself. Yet for some, only faith is sufficient to believe the Bible myths. Other apologistic excuses talk of conspiracies to hide biblical evidence, or they are simply still digging. The result is that after a century of modern research, neither biblical scholars nor archaeologists have been able to document as historical any of the events, much less the personalities. Tel Aviv University Professor Herzog, whose message was spelled out in the very headline, "The Bible, No Evidence on the Ground," has overwhelming support that today, armed with cutting-edge dating and molecular technologies, archaeologists increasingly agree with Herzog that the Bible does not reflect historical truths. But as excavations progressed in the 70s and 80s, rather than substantiation, what began to pile up was contradictions. If anything, archaeologists find inconsistencies between the biblical accounts and the facts. There are many books supporting biblical archaeology with hundreds and hundreds of pages. They mostly discuss archaeology models for dating chronologies, archaeology finds during the Deuteronomic history period, places and artifacts relating to life in Egypt, Palestine, and Jerusalem, and how people lived during those biblical times. But what they don't show is any real proof of real biblical people and events. Lastly, you can go to many museums all around the world and see bones and artifacts of non-biblical people throughout exactly the same time period as the biblical timeline. Their bones, jewelry, pottery, weapons, instruments, artwork, temples, tombs, as well as inscriptions in stone and papyrus. But the same is not true for biblical characters. We will further explore biblical authorship and cases of anachronisms in future videos that will shed more light on the reason for lack of archaeological evidence. Thank you.